What is the sound of absolute terror? It is not the scream. Screams are for the hopeful, for those who believe salvation might yet arrive. It is not the clash of steel, for that is the sound of conflict, of a fight that can still be won or lost. No. The sound of absolute soul-crushing terror is silence. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast forest, a place that should be alive with the chatter of birds and the rustle of leaves. But there is nothing. A dead, profound silence hangs in the air, heavy and thick like a shroud. As you step forward, the source of this unholy quiet reveals itself. It is a forest not of oak or pine, but of men. Thousands upon thousands of tall, sharpened stakes rise towards a gray sky, and upon each one, a body is impaled. Men, women, children. Some have been there for months, their flesh picked clean by crows who have long since grown fat and moved on. Others are fresh, their silent agony a testament to a new harvest of horror. This was not the work of a demon spat from the depths of hell. This was the meticulous, calculated work of a prince, a crusader, a man who prayed to the same God as you or I, a man whose people would one day call him a hero, a savior. His enemies, however, gave him a different name, one that would echo through eternity, Vlad the Impaler. But how does a man become a monster of this magnitude? How does a noble prince, a defender of the faith, become the architect of a nightmare so profound it would inspire the greatest vampire legend the world has ever known? Before he was Dracula, the creature of the night, he was Dracula, the son of the dragon. He was a prince of Wallachia, a small but fiercely independent land caught in the bloody jaws of two warring empires, the Kingdom of Hungary and the ever-expanding Ottoman Sultanate. His life was not one of Gothic castles and midnight feasts, but of betrayal, exile, and relentless, brutal warfare. We think we know him from novels and films, a pale aristocrat with a fatal charm, but the reality is infinitely more disturbing. The real man did not drink blood from the necks of virgins. He presided over forests of the dead. He did not fear the cross. He wielded it as a banner for his holy war. He was a master of psychological warfare, a political pragmatist whose currency was cruelty, whose language was fear. He turned human bodies into a declaration of power, a border wall built of flesh and bone to warn the most powerful army on earth this far, and no further. To understand the monster, we must first understand the boy, a boy sold by his own father into the gilded cage of the enemy, forced to learn the art of power from the very men he swore to destroy. The question we must ask is not simply, what did he do, but why? What furnace of trauma and ambition could forge such a soul? Was he a madman, a sadist who delighted in suffering? Or was he a coldly rational leader pushed to inhuman extremes by an inhuman world? The story of Vlad III is a chilling exploration of the paradox of power. It is a story that forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth that sometimes the figures who commit the most monstrous acts are not fighting for evil, but for something they passionately believe to be good. They are fighting for survival, for their people, for their God. And in their righteous crusade, they become the very evil they sought to destroy. Forget the fangs and the cape. The truth is far more intimate and far more terrifying. This is the story of how a man's broken soul gave birth to an immortal legend. This is the hidden past of the man they called the Impaler Prince. Our story begins not in a Transylvanian castle, but in the heart of the Ottoman Empire, the most powerful state in the 15th century world. In 1442, a boy of around 11 years old, Vlad and his younger, more handsome brother Radu were handed over by their own father, Vlad the Dracula, to Sultan Murad Suku. It was not an act of malice, but of desperate politics. Vlad the needed Ottoman support to keep his throne in Wallachia, a perpetually unstable land. The price of that support was his sons. They were political hostages, guarantees of their father's loyalty. But the Ottoman court was no mere prison. It was a university of power, a crucible designed to reshape the minds of its captives. The boys lived in gilded cages, educated in logic, philosophy, the Quran, and the arts of war alongside the Sultan's own sons, including the future Mehmed the Conqueror. They witnessed firsthand the terrifying efficiency of the Ottoman state, its absolute power, and its methods of dealing with dissent swift, public, and brutal. For Radu, the beautiful and charming younger brother, this world was seductive. He adapted, assimilated, and became a favorite of the court, a close friend to the young Mehmed. But for Vlad, every day was a lesson in hatred. He was proud, defiant, and resentful. He saw his captors not as mentors, but as enemies. He watched, he learned, and he nurtured a cold, burning rage. The psychological pressure was immense. Every letter from home, every diplomatic move his father made, could be the difference between a lavish dinner and a silken bowstring tightening around his neck. It was here, in the luxurious prison of Edirne, that the seeds of the Impaler were sown. He learned that mercy was a weakness the powerful could not afford, that loyalty was a commodity to be bought and sold, and that fear was a tool. More effective than any army, he witnessed public executions, the casual cruelty of a confident empire, and internalized a fundamental lesson to control others. You must first master their deepest terrors. His own father would eventually betray the Ottomans, sealing his own fate and that of Vlad's older brother, Mircea. They were brutally killed by Hungarian-backed boyars, the powerful nobles of Wallachia. Mircea was blinded with a red-hot poker and buried alive. News of this betrayal reached Vlad in the Ottoman court. His father and brother were dead, killed not by the Ottomans, but by their own people, the very nobles he was meant to one day rule. The lesson was complete. He was utterly alone, surrounded by enemies on all sides. His hatred now had a new target, not just the Ottomans who held him captive, but the treacherous boyars who had destroyed his family. The world was not a stage for honor and chivalry. It was a pit of vipers where only the most ruthless survived. In 1448, with Ottoman backing, Vlad made his first attempt on the Wallachian throne. It was a fleeting victory, lasting only 2 months before he was driven out by the Hungarian-backed rival. Vladislav II. 8 years of exile followed years spent wandering through Moldavia and Hungary, sharpening his skills, building alliances, and waiting. His moment came in 1456, as the Ottoman Empire, now under his childhood acquaintance Sultan Mehmed II, focused its might on the siege of Belgrade. Vlad saw his chance. With Hungarian and Wallachian support, he invaded his homeland and killed his rival in single combat. At the age of 25, Vlad III was finally the voivode, the ruler of Wallachia, and he had a long memory. His first act was to consolidate power, and his method was pure, theatrical terror. He knew the boyars, the wealthy, landed nobility were the source of the realm's instability. They had betrayed his father and brother. They would betray him too if given the chance. He decided to eliminate the threat in a single, unforgettable stroke. The story, likely embellished but rooted in truth, is a cornerstone of his legend. On Easter Sunday of 1457, he invited hundreds of boyars and their families to a grand feast in his capital, Târgoviște. He fed them, gave them wine, and made them feel secure. Then, as the feast reached its height, his soldiers barred the doors. Vlad rose and asked them a simple question. "How many princes have you known?" The nervous nobles began to count, naming ruler after ruler, many of whom had met violent ends, often with the boyars' own complicity. Vlad then announced that their treasonous reigns were over. The elder boyars, those directly responsible for his father's death, were immediately taken outside and impaled on stakes arranged around the city. The younger, healthier ones, along with their wives and children, were force-marched 50 miles up the Argeș River. They were stripped of their fine clothes and forced, in the mud and rock, to build a fortress with their bare hands. They worked until the clothes rotted off their bodies and they dropped dead from exhaustion. The fortress they built, Poenari Castle, would become Vlad's personal stronghold, a grim monument to his vengeance, built on the bones of his enemies. What would you do if you were in his place? If the very people you were meant to rule were the ones who had murdered your family and plunged your country into chaos for generations? Would you seek justice, or would you seek a vengeance so total it would burn your name into history? Comment your thoughts below. With his domestic enemies eliminated, Vlad turned his attention to what he saw as the ultimate threat, the Ottoman Empire. For years, he maintained a tense peace, even paying the jizya, the tribute tax, to Sultan Mehmed II. But this was merely a ploy to buy time. In the winter of 1461, he felt ready. He captured the Sultan's envoys who had come to collect the tribute, and in a gesture of ultimate defiance, had their turbans nailed to their heads because they refused to remove them in his presence, citing religious custom. He then launched a blistering surprise campaign south of the Danube into Ottoman territory, burning, pillaging, and slaughtering tens of thousands of Turks and Bulgarian Muslims. He wrote to his Hungarian ally, Matthias Corvinus, with chilling precision, "I have killed peasants, men and women, old and young. We killed 23,884 Turks, without counting those whom we burned in homes, or the Turks whose heads were cut by our soldiers." He even sent 2 bags filled with the noses and ears of his victims as proof. Sultan Mehmed II, the man who had conquered Constantinople, was enraged. He assembled a colossal army, perhaps over 150,000 strong, one of the largest forces of the era, and marched personally to crush the impudent Wallachian prince. Vlad's army was tiny in comparison, perhaps less than 30,000 men. He could not win a pitched battle. So he turned Wallachia itself into a weapon. He burned his own villages, poisoned wells, and created a scorched earth, a land of no man, to starve the invading army. He waged a brutal guerrilla war, with small, swift raids that melted back into the forests. His masterpiece of terror, however, was yet to come. In the dead of night, on June 17th, 1462, Vlad, disguised as a Turk, personally led a daring raid on the Sultan's own camp. The goal of this night attack was audacious: to fight through to the Sultan's tent and kill Mehmed himself. Chaos erupted in the Ottoman camp as the Wallachians slaughtered thousands in the darkness. While they failed to kill the Sultan, the psychological impact was devastating. But the final soul-shattering blow came a few days later. As Mehmed's exhausted and demoralized army advanced on Târgoviște, they came to a valley, and there it was, the forest, a mile wide and 3 miles long, 20,000 captured Turks and Bulgarian Muslims, the prisoners from his winter campaign, were impaled on a forest of stakes. The Sultan, a hardened warrior who had seen every horror of medieval warfare, was so sickened by the scale and artistry of the cruelty that he reportedly turned his army around. He had won the military campaign, but Vlad had won the psychological war. The master of terror had defeated the conqueror of worlds with a spectacle of death, and so we arrive at the heart of the paradox. Who was this man in Romania today? Vlad Tsipesh is often remembered as a national hero. He is seen as a fierce patriot, a strong leader who brought order to a chaotic land and stood defiantly against the overwhelming might of the Ottoman Empire. He is the defender of the faith, the last bastion of Christendom in the East. Schoolchildren are taught that his methods, while harsh, were necessary. He purged the corrupt and treacherous boyars who kept Wallachia weak and divided. He established law and order with an iron fist, making the roads so safe that a golden cup could be left in a town square, and no one would dare steal it. His war against the Ottomans is framed as a righteous crusade, a David and Goliath struggle for national survival. From this perspective, the impalements were not the acts of a madman, but a calculated and effective tool of statecraft and psychological warfare. How else could a tiny principality hope to deter an empire that had shattered the walls of Constantinople? Impalement was a message, written in the language of terror that his enemies would understand perfectly. He was a monster, yes, but he was their monster, a necessary evil in an age of wolves. However, outside of Romania, particularly in German and Turkish sources from the 15th and 16th centuries, a very different portrait emerges. Here, he is not a hero, but a psychopath, a blood-drinking demon, the original Dracula. These accounts, spread rapidly by the new technology of the printing press, were the tabloids of their day. They detailed his atrocities with grotesque relish, transforming a political figure into a supernatural monster. They tell stories of him dining amongst the forest of the impaled, dipping his bread in the blood of his victims. They describe him boiling people alive, nailing hats to heads, and taking sadistic pleasure in the elaborate torture of men, women, and children. In these pamphlets, his cruelty is not pragmatic, it is pathological. He is a Wutrecht, a bloodthirsty tyrant who kills for sport. The story of the Golden Cup is twisted. A foreign merchant complains of theft, and Vlad impales the thief along with his entire family, but also returns the stolen money with one extra coin. When the merchant correctly notes the extra coin, Vlad spares him, saying, "If you had not, I would have impaled you as well." This wasn't about justice. It was about absolute, terrifying, and arbitrary power. Here, he is not a defender of the faith, but a heretic whose cruelty shames the Christian name. This presents us with the central conflict. The question that hangs over his entire legacy was his brutality, a necessary means to a noble end. Or was the brutality the end in itself? Was he a pragmatist or a psychopath, a patriot or a monster? The answer, most likely, is that he was both. He was a product of his time, and his time was unimaginably violent. His actions were, in many ways, an amplification of the common practices of the age, but he applied them with a scale, a creativity, and a theatrical flair that set him apart. The contradiction is the key. It is easy to dismiss him as a one-dimensional villain, the monster from the horror story. It is far more difficult, and far more terrifying, to consider that he might have been a man of sincere conviction, a man who believed he was doing the right thing. This forces us to look beyond the simple label of evil and into the dark, complex machinery of the human psyche, and the brutal politics that can push a leader and a nation to the very edge of humanity. The real horror of Vlad the Impaler is not that he was a demon, but that he was a man. To truly understand the why behind Vlad, we must look through the lens of modern psychology. Vlad's childhood was a textbook case for the development of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD, unlike standard PTSD, which can result from a single event. CPTSD arises from prolonged, repeated trauma, especially during formative childhood years. For over a decade, from the tender age of 11, Vlad lived as a hostage. He was in a constant state of hypervigilance, knowing that his life depended on the whims of a foreign ruler and the political maneuvering of a father he could not trust. This prolonged exposure to threat, coupled with the profound betrayal of being handed over by his own parent, would have fundamentally rewired his developing brain. Individuals with CPTSD often exhibit a deep-seated distrust of others, a belief that the world is an inherently dangerous place, and a desperate need to maintain control at all costs. For Vlad, this manifested as an inability to trust anyone, especially the boyar class who had murdered his father and brother. His preemptive, brutal purges were not just acts of vengeance. They were a desperate attempt to create a secure environment, to eliminate any potential threat before it could materialize. His need for absolute control was not the megalomania of a simple tyrant. It was the survival mechanism of a traumatized child who had learned, in the most brutal way possible, that to be powerless was to be dead. His cruelty was a shield. The forest of the impaled was an externalization of his internal landscape, a world of pain, terror, and death, which he now projected onto his enemies to keep them at bay. Vlad's actions cannot be understood in a vacuum. We must also look at the sociological and political landscape of 15th century Wallachia. This region was a shatter zone, a violent frontier caught between the tectonic plates of massive empires, Catholic Hungary to the north and west, and the expanding Islamic Ottoman Empire to the south and east. In such a region, the rules of centralized, stable states did not apply. There was no overarching rule of law, no Geneva Convention. Power was the only recognized authority, and violence was the primary tool of politics. A ruler had to be strong, not just effective, but visibly and performatively strong. A reputation for terrifying brutality was a political asset. It deterred invasion from without and rebellion from within. Vlad's methods, while extreme, were an amplified version of the political language of his time. Other rulers impaled, tortured, and made examples of their enemies. Vlad simply did it on a grander, more systematic, and more publicized scale. He weaponized terror in a way no one else had. His target audience was not just the victims on the stakes, but the sultan in his palace and the boyars in their manors. Impalement was a political broadcast, a clear and unambiguous signal of his power and his ruthlessness. In the brutal calculus of 15th century statecraft, creating a forest of 20,000 dead enemies to save his country of 500,000 from invasion and annihilation could be argued, by him, as a rational, if horrifying, choice. It was a strategy born from a world where state survival depended not on diplomacy, but on the credible threat of absolute annihilation. While psychology and sociology provide the primary framework, recent scientific analysis has added a fascinating, if grim, biological footnote to Vlad's story. Researchers studying letters personally written by Vlad III have analyzed the biomolecules left behind the sweat, fingerprints, and perhaps even tears of the man himself. The preliminary findings are astonishing. The proteins and peptides found suggest that he may have suffered from inflammatory conditions, possibly respiratory tract issues. But most shockingly, they found proteins consistent with a condition known as hemolacria, which causes an individual to cry tears mixed with blood. Imagine the psychological effect, both on Vlad himself and on those who witnessed it. A prince, in a moment of rage or sorrow, weeping bloody tears. It would have solidified his monstrous, supernatural reputation. While not definitive proof, this sliver of biological data paints a picture of a man under extreme physiological stress, a body at war with itself, just as his nation was at war with the world. This wasn't a healthy man ruling from a comfortable throne. This was a man whose body may have been breaking down under the immense pressure of his life, his trauma, and his own brutal decisions. The bloody tears, a mythic element of saints and demons, may have been a literal, biological reality for the Impaler Prince, adding another layer of horror and tragedy to his already dark saga. Vlad the Impaler was not an anomaly in the grand sweep of history. He belongs to a specific, terrifying archetype, the monster as founder, the tyrant who forges a nation from chaos and blood. Look at Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China. He standardized writing, currency, and measurements, and built the Great Wall. He also burned books, buried scholars alive, and ruled with a paranoid brutality that consumed his own family. He created China, but at an unimaginable human cost. Look at Ivan the Terrible, the first Tsar of Russia. He expanded his empire and centralized power, but he also created the Oprichniki, a black-clad secret police who terrorized his own people, and in a fit of rage, murdered his own son and heir. These figures, like Vlad, stand on a philosophical knife's edge. They raise the eternal, uncomfortable question first posed by Machiavelli, who wrote his masterpiece, The Prince, just a few decades after Vlad's death. Is it better for a ruler to be loved or to be feared? Vlad, Ivan, and Qin Shi Huang are history's blood-soaked answer. They chose fear, and they used it to hammer fractious, warring states into unified nations. They believed that the chaos of civil war and foreign domination was a greater evil than the tyranny required to end it. They saw individual lives as expendable bricks in the great cathedral of the state. This leads us to a deeper, more personal philosophical question. Does the end justify the means? If Vlad's forest of the impaled truly did save Wallachia from being absorbed into the Ottoman Empire, was it worth it? Can the survival and sovereignty of a nation be built upon a foundation of mass atrocity? There is no easy answer. We, from the comfort of our relatively peaceful present, are quick to condemn. But we are not faced with the imminent threat of annihilation. We do not have to choose between the subjugation of our people and an act of unspeakable cruelty. This is the tragic dimension of leaders like Vlad. They are often forced to operate in a realm beyond conventional morality, where every choice is a choice between evils. Where is the line between a strong leader who makes hard decisions and a tyrant who revels in cruelty? Who gets to draw that line? History, the victors or the victims? The story of Vlad challenges our own moral certainties. It forces us to imagine ourselves in his position, a prince with his back against the wall, his family murdered, his people divided, and the world's greatest superpower knocking at his door. What would you become in that crucible? What price would you be willing to pay for the survival of your home? Perhaps the ultimate tragedy of Vlad is that his brutal methods ultimately failed. His victory over Mehmed was Pyrrhic. The Sultan, repulsed, but not defeated, simply changed tactics. He backed Vlad's own brother, the handsome and popular Radu, who had grown up in the Ottoman court. Radu led an army of Turks and disaffected Wallachians against Vlad, promising peace and stability. The boyars, who had always preferred a pliable ruler, flocked to Radu's side, betrayed by his allies, his people, and his own brother. Vlad was forced to flee to Hungary, where he was imprisoned by Matthias Corvinus, the very man he had been counting on for aid. His reign of terror had bought him a brief, spectacular moment of defiance, but it had not secured his throne or his country's long-term independence. The order he created was as brittle as the bones it was built on. This is the final, bitter irony. The man who trusted no one was undone by betrayal. The man who tried to control everything lost it all. His story serves as a dark, cautionary tale. A philosophical lesson written in blood. Fear is a powerful tool, but it is a poor foundation. It can build a fortress, but it cannot build a home. It can command obedience, but it can never command love or lasting loyalty. And a kingdom built only on fear is destined to collapse into the very chaos it was created to prevent. Vlad's story is profoundly modern because it is a story about the power of narrative, the birth of propaganda. The image of Vlad as a blood-drinking monster was largely created and disseminated by his enemies, particularly Saxon merchants in Transylvania who were angered by his trade policies. They utilized the most advanced information technology of the 15th century, Gutenberg's printing press. German pamphlets, filled with lurid woodcuts and sensationalized accounts of his cruelty, spread across Europe like wildfire. These were the first viral fake news stories. They took a real, brutal ruler and exaggerated his crimes, adding supernatural elements to create a figure of pure evil. They weren't interested in political nuance. They were interested in character assassination. Meanwhile, in Romania, a different narrative was being forged through oral traditions, ballads, and chronicles passed down through generations. The story of Vlad the hero emerged the stern but just ruler, the defender of the nation. So from the very beginning, there were two Vlads, the monster of the printing press and the hero of the campfire story. This schism is incredibly relevant today. We live in an age of information warfare, where nations, political factions, and individuals use social media to construct competing narratives. We see heroes and villains being manufactured in real time, with context stripped away and emotional, often shocking. Imagery used to sway public opinion. The story of Vlad is a 500-year-old case study in how the same set of facts can be spun to create either a saint or a demon, and how the technology of the day can be used to amplify one narrative over the other until it becomes an accepted truth. He is a testament to the fact that history is not just what happened, but who gets to tell the story. The psychological profile of Vlad, a leader forged by childhood trauma who responds to threats with extreme, preemptive violence, is a pattern that repeats itself throughout history and into the modern day. We often see that cycles of violence, both personal and political, are self-perpetuating. A generation that grows up amidst war, instability, and betrayal often produces leaders who see the world through that same lens. They may promise to end the chaos, but their methods are often drawn from the very brutality they experienced. This speaks to the enduring appeal of the strongman archetype in politics. In times of great fear, economic instability, or national humiliation, societies often become drawn to leaders who project an aura of absolute strength and certainty. These leaders, like Vlad, often bypass due process, demonize enemies both internal and external, and promise to restore order through sheer force of will. They offer a simple solution to complex problems: unwavering, often brutal, strength. The appeal is primal. It speaks to a desire for a protector, a father figure who will slay the monsters in the dark. But the danger, as Vlad's story shows, is that the protector can become the monster. The very qualities that make a strong man appealing in a crisis: their ruthlessness, their disregard for norms, their willingness to use violence, are the same qualities that make them terrifying tyrants once power is consolidated. Vlad is the historical blueprint for this phenomenon, a dark mirror reflecting our own modern anxieties and our dangerous attraction to the illusion of order promised by the Iron Fist. The final, most ironic chapter of Vlad's story is his modern legacy. The historical Vlad, the complex and brutal voivode of Wallachia, has been almost entirely consumed by his fictional counterpart, Count Dracula. The man's reality has been replaced by a pop culture myth. Bran Castle in Romania is marketed as Dracula's Castle, despite the fact that Vlad likely never spent more than a night there, if at all. His name is used to sell t-shirts, plastic fangs, and tours through a landscape that has been reimagined to fit a Victorian novelist's fantasy. The national hero and the bloodthirsty tyrant have both been sidelined in favor of a commercialized Gothic monster. This commodification of history is a profoundly modern phenomenon. We sanitize the past, strip it of its brutal, inconvenient truths, and repackage it as entertainment. The real horror of Vlad, the political terror, the psychological trauma, the moral ambiguity is too complex and disturbing for a souvenir shop. It's much easier to sell a story about a vampire. In a way, this is the ultimate victory for his 15th century propagandists. Their monstrous caricature, born from political and economic disputes, has outlived the man himself, becoming one of the most recognizable figures in global culture. Vlad's story in the 21st century is a powerful reminder of how memory and legacy can be bought, sold, and transformed, and how the scariest parts of our history are often the ones we choose to forget, replacing them with fantasies that are far more comfortable and far more profitable. The real Impaler Prince has been impaled one last time, on the stake of pop culture, so we are left where we began, in the shadow of the Impaler. Was he a hero who used monstrous means to achieve a noble end, a sadistic madman who found a political justification for his pathology, or simply a broken man? A traumatized boy who remade the world in the image of his own suffering? The truth, as always, is elusive, buried under centuries of propaganda, myth, and national pride. He remains a figure of profound contradiction, a crusader who used the tactics of the devil, a nation-builder whose methods were pure deconstruction, a man whose name is synonymous with a fictional monster, yet whose reality was infinitely more complex and terrifying. The story of Vlad the Impaler is not a simple tale of good versus evil. It is a story about the gray, blood-soaked space in between, where survival and atrocity become indistinguishable. His ultimate fate is shrouded in as much mystery as his life. After years of imprisonment, he regained the Wallachian throne for a third and final time in 1476, only to be killed in battle shortly after. The exact circumstances of his death are unknown. One story claims he was assassinated by treacherous boyars. Another, that he was accidentally killed by his own men after being mistaken for a Turk. His head was reportedly cut off and sent to Sultan Mehmed in a jar of honey, a final gruesome trophy. His body was said to be buried in a monastery at Snagov, an island near Bucharest. But when archaeologists opened the tomb in the 1930s, it was empty. The man who created a forest of the dead left behind no trace of himself, vanishing from the world as if he were one of the supernatural creatures of legend. The legacy of Vlad the Impaler is not a single story, but a mirror. What we see in him often reflects our own beliefs about power, justice, and the price of survival. He is a historical inkblot test. What do you see? A hero, a villain, a victim? The answer says as much about us as it does about him. The past is never truly dead, and its most terrifying figures still have much to teach us about the darkness that lies not in myth or legend, but within the human heart itself. What is your verdict on the Impaler Prince? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to explore more hidden, dark corners of the past, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell for more from the hidden past.